Welcome to Sherlock Midnight Echo, where every whisper hides a chilling mystery.
The village of Little Hawthorne prided itself on being the sort of place where nothing truly dreadful ever happened, at least not without ample warning. It was a village of tidy hedgerows and well-swept paths, of bells that rang on time and habits that rarely changed. Christmas Eve, in particular, followed a pattern as dependable as the church clock, morning frost on the green, last-minute shopping at the post office, and by late afternoon, the gathering at Holly Lodge for Mrs. Penelope Farrow's annual Christmas game. Holly Lodge stood at the edge of the village, a gracious Georgian house whose windows glowed warmly against the early winter dusk. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine, cloves, and something faintly sweet, mulled wine, perhaps, or the brandied pudding cooling in the kitchen. Candles flickered on every available surface, lending the rooms a soft, forgiving light that smoothed wrinkles and softened expressions. Mrs. Farrow herself presided over the drawing room like a benevolent monarch. She was a handsome woman in her late 50s, with iron-grey hair arranged impeccably, and a voice that carried authority even when she spoke gently. "Now, do take a glass," she was saying, gesturing toward the sideboard. "There's no point in playing the game of deceit if everyone is sober. It ruins the spirit of the thing." A ripple of polite laughter followed. The game, introduced several years earlier as a novelty, had become a Christmas Eve tradition. Each guest drew a card assigning them a secret role: liar, truth-teller, observer. The object was simple enough: to conceal one's role while deducing the roles of others. It was meant to be amusing, mildly deceptive, and entirely harmless. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the fire with her knitting, accepted her glass with a murmured thanks. She had been invited, as always, out of courtesy and affection, rather than any expectation of participation. The villagers regarded her as pleasant but inconsequential, a white-haired spinster with a talent for wool and a fondness for village gossip. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she settled back into her chair. Games, she thought, were very revealing things. People behaved quite differently when given permission, indeed encouragement, to deceive. Around the room, the guests assembled, each carrying with them a private history and a carefully maintained public face. There was Mr. Harold Kemp, the village solicitor, whose thin smile never quite reached his eyes. He stood near the mantelpiece, discussing recent council matters with Reverend Lionel Brooke, a mild man with anxious hands and a habit of smoothing his cassock, even when not wearing it. Near the window, Clara Whitby, recently returned to the village after a prolonged absence in London, laughed a little too brightly at something Edward Farrow, Mrs. Farrow's stepson, had said. Edward was tall, dark-haired and restless, with the air of someone perpetually dissatisfied with his surroundings. And then there was Margaret Bell, the schoolmistress, whose sharp gaze missed very little. She sipped her drink in silence, observing the room with an expression that suggested she was already keeping score. Mrs. Farrow clapped her hands lightly. "Shall we begin? Cards are on the table." There was a small flurry of movement as everyone selected a card, glancing at it surreptitiously before slipping it into a pocket or handbag. Miss Marple, declining to play, contented herself with watching fingers and faces instead. It was curious, she reflected, how even the most practiced liars betrayed themselves in the smallest ways. A tightening of the lips, a pause too long before answering. One saw the same thing in village life, only spread over years instead of minutes. The game commenced amid laughter and playful accusations. "I don't believe a word you're saying, Harold," Clara said, her eyes sparkling. "You hesitated." "I always hesitate," Mr. Kemp replied smoothly. "It's a professional hazard." Edward leaned forward. "That's exactly what a liar would say." Margaret Bell's mouth twitched, or what a truth-teller would say. "Knowing you'd think that—" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She noticed that Mrs. Farrow, though ostensibly enjoying herself, kept a close watch on Edward. There was something proprietary in her gaze, something edged with concern. As the game progressed, the atmosphere grew more animated. Voices rose, accusations flew, and alliances formed and dissolved with cheerful speed. Yet beneath the merriment, ran an undercurrent Miss Marple found difficult to ignore, a tension that had nothing to do with the game itself. It surfaced in Edward's sharp laugh when Clara accused him of lying, in Mr. Kemp's quick glance toward Mrs. Farrow whenever money was mentioned, even in jest, in the way Reverend Brooke avoided Margaret Bell's eyes entirely. Then, quite suddenly, the lights went out. There was a collective gasp, followed by nervous laughter. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," Mrs. Farrow's voice rang out. "It's only the old wiring. Edward, do see if—" Her sentence was cut short by a sound that did not belong to any Christmas Eve gathering, a heavy thud, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Someone screamed. The lights flickered, then returned, bathing the room once more in candlelit warmth. For a moment, no one moved. Then Clara Whitby dropped her glass. Mrs. Farrow lay on the rug near the card table, one arm twisted beneath her at an unnatural angle. Her eyes were open, staring fixedly at the ceiling, and a thin line of blood traced its way from her temple into the patterned carpet. Reverend Brooke knelt beside her at once, fingers trembling as he reached for her wrist. He looked up, his face ashen. She's dead." The word fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock through every face present. "No," Edward said hoarsely. "That's impossible. She was just—" Margaret Bell had already moved to the door. "No one leaves," she said sharply, surprising them all. "Not yet." Mr. Kemp swallowed. This must have been an accident. She fell in the dark." Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. She did not hurry. There was no need. An accident, she thought gently, was what people always preferred to believe. It was comforting, reassuring. It asked nothing of them except sympathy. She looked down at Mrs. Farrow's still form, then at the overturned chair beside the card table. Her gaze lingered just for a moment on the scattered playing cards, one of them face up, its printed words stark in the candlelight. "Liar." Miss Marple sighed softly. Christmas Eve, she reflected, was a very revealing time indeed. No one spoke for several seconds after Reverend Brooke's pronouncement. The crackle of the fire seemed suddenly indecently loud, and somewhere in the house a clock began to chime the hour, its cheerful notes grotesquely out of place. Edward Farrow was the first to move. He took a step toward his stepmother, then stopped short, as though an invisible barrier had been raised between him and the body. "This is absurd," he said again, more sharply now. The lights went out. She must have tripped. Anyone could have— Margaret Bell rounded on him. "Do you often strike your head hard enough to bleed when you trip, Mr. Farrow?" Edward flushed. "I didn't mean only that we shouldn't jump to conclusions," Miss Marple observed him quietly. Young men, she reflected, were often most distressed not by death itself, but by the inconvenience it caused to their expectations. Mr. Kemp cleared his throat. "Margaret is right about one thing. Until the police arrive, it would be prudent for us all to remain here." Clara Whitby had sunk onto the nearest chair, her face pale beneath its carefully applied color. "The police?" she whispered. "Do you really think—" "I think," said Mr. Kemp carefully, "that Mrs. Farrow did not simply collapse." Reverend Brooke rose slowly, rubbing his hands together as though to warm them. "There was a blow," he said. "I felt the swelling, and the angle of her fall. Well, I am no doctor, but you know when something is wrong," Margaret finished. "We all do." Miss Marple moved closer to the card table, her eyes on the rug. The blood, she noticed, had spread in a narrow line, not pooled. She bent slightly, peering at the overturned chair. "How very unfortunate," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. Edward shot her an impatient glance. "Unfortunate? The woman is dead." "Yes, dear," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "That is precisely what I meant." There was a sudden, sharp sound, as Clara Whitby began to cry, not loudly, but with a thin, strained intensity that set everyone's nerves on edge. "I can't bear this," she said. "I only came back for Christmas. I never imagined Penelope was always so careful." "So careful," Margaret echoed, her eyes narrowing. "That's an interesting word." Mr. Kemp stiffened. "Really, Margaret, this is hardly the moment for honesty?" she asked coolly. "We've been playing at Deceit all evening. Perhaps it's time we stopped pretending. Miss Marple's needles, which she had resumed almost unconsciously, paused. Pretending, she thought, was the chief occupation of village life. The doorbell rang. They all jumped. Edward stared toward the hall. That must be the police already. No, said Miss Marple gently. It's too soon for that. She was correct. When Edward opened the door, it was not a uniformed officer, but Mrs. Elsie Grant, Holly Lodge's housekeeper, her cheeks red from the cold and her eyes wide with alarm. I saw the lights go out, she said breathlessly. And then I heard shouting. Is something wrong? Margaret stepped aside to let her see into the drawing room. Mrs. Grant's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, my God, she whispered. Mrs. Farrow. Reverend Brooke guided her gently to a chair. Please, sit down. We've sent for the police. Mrs. Grant nodded numbly. I only stepped out to fetch more logs. The wiring's been troublesome all week. Mrs. Farrow said she'd have it seen to after Christmas. Edward's head snapped up. You knew the lights might fail? Yes, sir. Everyone did. Miss Marple glanced at him, her expression placid. Knowledge shared by everyone, she reflected, was often knowledge no one truly examined. Time stretched unpleasantly. No one wished to sit, yet no one wished to move. The game cards lay forgotten on the table, their neat order disturbed by the earlier excitement. Miss Marple reached out and straightened them, aligning the edges with habitual care. Do you think, she said softly, that we might all say where we were standing when the lights went out? They looked at her in surprise. It may help, she added apologetically. I find it so easy to forget such things later. Mr. Kemp hesitated, then nodded. Very well. I was here by the mantelpiece. So was I, said Reverend Brooke quickly. Margaret shook her head. No, Reverend. You were nearer the window. You just moved. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. If you say so. Edward folded his arms. I was near the sideboard. Clara swallowed. I was speaking to Edward. I hadn't moved. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Already, she thought, the edges did not quite align. And Mrs. Farrow, she asked. There was a pause. She was standing by the card table, said Mr. Kemp. Addressing us, Miss Marple looked again at the overturned chair, at the angle of the body, at the card still face up on the rug. Standing, she repeated thoughtfully. The sound of a car pulling up outside cut through the room. Blue light flickered briefly against the curtains. The police, Edward said, with unmistakable relief. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire, folding her hands neatly in her lap. There would be plenty of time for questions now, plenty of time for people to say what they thought ought to be true, and as she knew so well, that was when the most interesting things began to emerge. The policemen entered with an air of subdued efficiency, bringing with them the cold breath of the night and the unmistakable authority of the outside world. The taller of the two introduced himself as Inspector Mallory, a solid man with a steady gaze that seemed to rest on everything at once. His companion, younger and more alert, carried a notebook already open. Inspector Mallory took in the scene in silence, the body on the rug, the overturned chair, the pale, strained faces gathered around the room. He nodded once, as though confirming something to himself. Who found her? He asked. Reverend Brooke stepped forward. I did. I checked for a pulse, and you are Lionel Brooke. The vicar. Mallory inclined his head. Very well. No one has touched anything since? Margaret Bell's voice cut in crisply. No. I made sure of it. Mallory looked at her with mild interest. You did? Yes. It seemed sensible. Miss Marple noted the faint tightening around Margaret's mouth. Sensible people, she reflected, often enjoyed being right far more than they admitted. The younger constable knelt beside Mrs. Farrow, examining the wound with professional care. Blunt force trauma, he murmured, likely caused by a fall, or by something else. Mallory straightened. We'll leave that to the doctor. Now then, this was a gathering, I understand. A Christmas Eve game, said Mr. Kemp. A silly tradition. Silly things, said Mallory mildly, have a way of becoming serious. He turned slowly, his gaze moving from one face to another. I'll want a brief account from each of you, nothing formal yet, just where you were and what you saw. Edward Farrow spoke first, eager, Miss Marple thought, to establish himself. The lights went out. There was a noise. When they came back on, she was on the floor. That's all. And before the lights went out? Edward hesitated. We were playing the game. What sort of game? Mr. Kemp explained, his tone faintly apologetic. A party game involving deception, entirely harmless. Mallory raised an eyebrow. Deception? Yes, well, pretend deception. Miss Marple's lips twitched. And Mrs. Farrow? Mallory asked. Was she enjoying herself? Clara Whitby answered before anyone else could. Of course she was, she always did. Penelope loved being in control. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. I mean, Clara added quickly, she loved hosting. Mallory made a note. Did anyone argue with her this evening? No, Edward said at once. Margaret Bell's eyes flicked toward him. Not openly, Mallory noticed. Meaning, only that families have their tensions, Margaret replied evenly. And so do villages. Miss Marple Watsey, head the inspector carefully. He was listening more than speaking now, allowing the room to fill the silence for him. It was a sensible approach. And you, miss? He asked, turning to her. Oh, I'm afraid I'm only an observer, Miss Marple said pleasantly. I wasn't playing. But you were watching, yes. And did you notice anything out of the ordinary? Miss Marple considered. Only that the lights went out at a most inconvenient moment. Mallory smiled faintly. They do tend to... The doctor arrived shortly thereafter, confirming what they already suspected. Death had been instantaneous, caused by a heavy blow to the head. Not a fall, he added quietly, but a strike delivered with some force. The word murder was not spoken aloud, but it settled over the room all the same. Mrs. Grant began to sob softly. Reverend Brooke put an arm around her shoulders. Edward stared at the floor. Clara's eyes darted from face to face, as though seeking reassurance that no one was looking too closely at her. Mallory closed his notebook. I'll need you all to remain available. No one is to leave the village tonight. Edward bristled. You can't seriously think one of us... I think, Mallory said calmly, that Mrs. Farrow was killed during a power outage in a locked room full of people. Until I know how and why, everyone here is of interest. Miss Marple nodded to herself. That, she thought, was quite correct. As the others drifted into subdued conversation, she allowed her gaze to wander once more to the card table. The cards had been gathered now, stacked neatly by the constable. One lay slightly askew at the top. She rose quietly and approached him. Excuse me, she said. May I? He hesitated, then handed her the card. It read, Observer. Miss Marple returned it with a gentle smile. How very appropriate. She went back to her chair, her mind already arranging impressions as neatly. Her knitting. People believed games ended when the rules were put away. But the most revealing part, she knew, always came afterward. When no one thought they were still playing at all, the house seemed to shrink once the police had finished their initial questions, as though the walls themselves were drawing closer in response to what they now contained. Inspector Mallory ordered the drawing-room sealed for the night, and Mrs. Grant, still pale and shaken, was sent upstairs with instructions to remain there. One by one, the guests were escorted out into the cold, their earlier warmth and laughter replaced by a brittle silence. Miss Marple walked back through the village with Margaret Bell, the frost crunching beneath their feet. A dreadful business, Margaret said at last. I never cared for Penelope Farrow, but I wouldn't have wished this. No, Miss Marple agreed. Wishing is such a dangerous thing. Margaret glanced at her. You think this was no accident? I think, said Miss Marple gently, that accidents are often very carefully arranged. Margaret gave a short, humorless laugh. You sound as though you've seen such things before. Oh, many times, Miss Marple said. Human nature is remarkably consistent. They parted at the corner, and Miss Marple made her way home, her thoughts as methodical as her steps. She replayed the evening in her mind, the positions in the room, the expressions at the moment the lights failed, the subtle shifts that followed. There was, she felt, something oddly theatrical about it all, as though someone had been waiting for precisely that moment. The next morning brought no comfort. Snow had fallen lightly in the night, softening the village into a postcard scene that felt cruelly at odds with reality. Miss Marple was halfway through her breakfast when the knock came at the door. Inspector Mallory stood on her step, hat in hand. "Miss Marple," he said, "may I come in?" "Of course," she replied. "I was just making tea." He accepted gratefully, settling into the chair opposite her. "I understand you were present last night." "Yes." "And you were not playing the game?" "No. I prefer to watch." Mallory smiled. "So I gathered." He took a sip of tea, then set the cup down carefully. "Tell me, did anything strike you as unusual before the lights went out?" Miss Marple considered. "Mrs. Farrow was standing," she said, addressing the room. "Yes, and yet she fell backward, not forward, which suggests she was struck from the side or behind." Mallory nodded slowly. "That is our thinking as well. There is also the matter of the chair," Miss Marple went on. "It was overturned, but not broken, as though it had been pushed aside rather than fallen upon." Mallory's eyes sharpened. "You notice that? It's surprising how often people overlook furniture," she said. "They're so busy watching one another." Mallory leaned back. "We've established that the power was cut deliberately. The fuse box is in the pantry. Anyone familiar with the house could have reached it in seconds." "Mrs. Grant," Miss Marple suggested mildly. "She was outside. We've confirmed that. And the others? All had opportunity." Miss Marple nodded. Opportunity, she reflected, was rarely in short supply. "There's one more thing," Mallory said. "Mrs. Farrow's will." "Oh?" "It was changed recently. The bulk of the estate was left to Edward Farrow, until a codicil was added last week. It redirects a significant portion elsewhere." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "To whom?" Mallory hesitated. "We're still tracing that." After he left, Miss Marple sat quietly for some time, her hands folded in her lap. Money, she thought, was the most reliable motive of all, but rarely the only one. That afternoon she received a visit from Clara Whitby. ID. "Didn't sleep at all," Clara said, pacing the small sitting room. "They'll think it was me. I argued with her earlier in the week." "Did you?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes, about something private. She threatened me." "Threats," Miss Marple observed, "are often more frightening to the person who makes them than to the one who hears them." Clara stopped short. "What do you mean?" "Only that secrets have a way of turning on their keepers." Clara stared at her, then shook her head. "You don't understand." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "On the contrary, my dear, I understand very well indeed." As Clara left, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the snow lay pristine and unmarked, concealing whatever lay beneath. It was, she reflected, very much like the village itself. By evening the snow had begun to melt, leaving the lanes slick and treacherous, and with it came a restlessness that seemed to seep into every house in Little Hawthorne. Miss Marple felt it herself, as she prepared a light supper, an awareness that the village, so carefully smoothed over by habit and courtesy, was beginning to crack. She had just settled by the fire when the telephone rang. "Yes?" she said. "Miss Marple?" Inspector Mallory's voice came briskly down the line. "I thought you might like to know. We've identified the beneficiary in the codicil." "I thought I might," Miss Marple replied. "Do tell me." "Clara Whitby." There was a pause, but only a very slight one. "How interesting," Miss Marple said at last, "and how very uncomfortable for her. You're not surprised?" "No," Miss Marple admitted. "Mrs. Farrow was a woman who liked to keep people dependent upon her goodwill. Leaving money is a very effective way of doing that, especially if it comes with conditions." Mallory exhaled. "You think there were conditions? I should be astonished if there were not." After the call ended, Miss RPLE sat quite still. Clara Whitby's agitation that afternoon replayed itself in her mind. The nervous pacing, the half-spoken fear. Fear of being suspected, certainly, but also fear of something else. The next morning brought further developments. Edward Farrow arrived unannounced, his manner taut with barely restrained anger. "They've frozen the accounts," he said, striding into the sitting room. "Until the will is settled." "Yes," Miss Marple said calmly. "That is quite usual. It's absurd. That money is mine by right. I've lived with her for years." "And yet," Miss Marple observed, "living with someone does not always mean knowing them." Edward stopped short. "You think she meant to cut me out entirely?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that Mrs. Farrow enjoyed keeping her options open." He laughed harshly. "You make her sound like a monster." "Oh no," Miss Marple said gently. "Only human." He left soon after, slamming the door behind him. Miss Marple noted with some interest that he had not once mentioned grief. Later that day, Margaret Bell stopped by with a basket of scones and a look of determined curiosity. "They're saying Clara had a motive," she said bluntly. "Money, threats, the whole melodrama." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Very tidy." Margaret frowned. "You don't believe it?" "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that tidy explanations are rarely the correct ones." Margaret leaned forward. "Then who?" Miss Marple smiled. "It's not a matter of who yet. It's a matter of how—" She rose and fetched her knitting, settling back into her chair. The lights went out. Everyone assumed confusion. But confusion is only useful if people behave unpredictably. In truth, most people behave exactly as they always do. Margaret considered this. Edward panicked. "Yes." Clara froze. "Indeed." "And Mr. Kemp?" Miss Marple's needles paused. Mr. Kemp watched. That evening in Deceit Mallory returned, bringing with him news of a second, smaller discovery. In the pantry, near the fuse box, they had found a playing card tucked behind a stack of tins. "What sort of card?" Miss Marple asked. Mallory hesitated. "Liar?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "How very careless, or very deliberate." "Quite so," she agreed. After he left, Miss Marple went to bed early, though she did not sleep at once. Her mind moved steadily, assembling fragments: the game, the power cut, the will, the card left behind like a signature too obvious to be accidental. Someone, she thought, had wanted the crime to look impulsive, to suggest panic, greed, a sudden blow struck in the dark. But there was nothing impulsive about the timing, or the staging, or the choice of game. She closed her eyes, already certain of one thing: the murderer had not struck in the darkness at all. They had struck in the moment just before it. Miss Marple rose early the next morning with a curious sense of calm. It was the sort of calm she associated with finishing a complicated piece of knitting. The pattern had revealed itself at last, even if a few stitches still needed careful checking. Outside, the village stirred cautiously, as though afraid of what the day might bring. She wrapped herself warmly and set out for a walk, her path taking her, quite naturally, past Holly Lodge. The house stood quiet now, its windows dark, the cheerful Christmas wreath still fixed to the door in a manner that struck Miss Marple as faintly indecent. Death, she reflected, always made decorations look foolish. Inspector Mallory's car was parked outside. She was not surprised. Inside, the house felt altered, emptier, stripped of its former authority. Mallory greeted her with a nod. "We're reconstructing the evening," he said. "Timings, movements—" "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said. "Movements are so very revealing." He led her in. To the pantry. The fuse box was open, its metal surface dull and smudged. "It takes less than 10 seconds to cut the power," Mallory said, "and less than 10 to restore it. Provided one knows precisely what one is doing," Miss Marple replied. Mallory glanced at her. "You're thinking of someone methodical." "I'm thinking of someone who dislikes uncertainty," she said. "Someone who would not trust to darkness alone." He frowned. "Meaning?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she moved back toward the drawing room. The furniture had been returned to its original positions as far as possible, though the absence of Mrs. Farrow's presence left an unmistakable void. "May I?" she asked, indicating the card table. Mallory nodded. She stood where Mrs. Farrow had stood, her gaze sweeping the room. "She was addressing you all," she murmured, "which means everyone was looking at her, yes. And therefore," Miss Marple went on, "no one was looking at anyone else." Mallory's eyes sharpened. You think the blow was struck before the lights went out? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that the lights going out served a different purpose entirely. To confuse the issue, to provide a convenient explanation, she agreed. Darkness excuses many things. Mallory was silent for a moment. The doctor estimated death occurred seconds before the power failure. Miss Marple smiled faintly. How obliging of the facts. Later that afternoon, the village provided its own contributions. Margaret Bell reported that Mr. Kemp had cancelled school legal consultations indefinitely. Clara Whitby had shut herself indoors, her curtains drawn. Edward Farrow was seen arguing heatedly with the bank manager. Miss Marple listened to it all over tea at the vicarage, Reverend Brooke wringing his hands as he spoke. I can't reconcile it, he said. Penelope was difficult, yes, but murder? Diffic. Old people, Miss Marple said kindly, often inspire very strong feelings. Strong feelings, when carefully managed, can be quite dangerous. He looked at her uneasily. You speak as though you know. I know the type, she said. One sees it in villages all the time. The person who arranges things, who pulls strings gently, smiling all the while. That evening, Inspector Mallory called again. We've confirmed something else, he said. Mrs. Farrow met with Mr. Kemp privately 2 days before her death. About the codicil, Miss Marple suggested. Yes, and according to the clerk, voices were raised. Miss Marple nodded. Mr. Kemp is a man who prides himself on control. Being overruled would not sit well with him. Mallory hesitated. You're suggesting the solicitor? I am suggesting, Miss Marple replied, that when people play games involving deception, they often reveal exactly how far they are willing to go to maintain an illusion. There was a pause. I'll need proof, Mallory said at last. Miss Marple smiled. Of course you will, and I believe you shall have it, if you allow me to ask a few innocent questions. The next day, at her suggestion, Mallory invited the remaining guests of that fatal evening to return to Holly Lodge. Officially, it was to clarify inconsistencies. Unofficially, Miss Marple suspected, it was because the inspector had begun to trust her instincts. They gathered once more in the drawing-room, uneasily, as though the walls themselves remembered. Miss Marple took her usual seat by the fire, knitting in hand. Such a pity, she said conversationally, that games must end. Mr. Kemp stiffened almost imperceptibly. But, she continued, some people find it terribly hard to stop playing. The silence that followed Miss Marple's remark seemed to thicken the air. The fire snapped sharply, and Edward Farrow shifted in his chair with an impatience. Tit! Had bordered on hostility. This is ridiculous, he said. Why are we here again? Haven't we said everything there is to say? Inspector Mallory regarded him steadily. People often say many things, Mr. Farrow. They don't always say the same things twice. Edward subsided, though his jaw remained clenched. Miss Marple's eyes moved from face to face with gentle curiosity. Clara Whitby sat rigidly upright, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white. Margaret Bell leaned back, watchful and alert. Reverend Brooke looked deeply uncomfortable, as though he would have preferred almost anything to this enforced intimacy. Mr. Kemp, by contrast, appeared composed. Too composed, Miss Marple thought, like a man who had carefully prepared his part. Inspector Mallory cleared his throat. I'd like each of you to describe once again what you were doing just before Mrs. Farrow fell. There was a faint note of weariness in his voice, but also determination. Mr. Kemp spoke first, smoothly. As I said before, I was by the mantelpiece, speaking with Reverend Brooke. The vicar nodded quickly. Yes, that's correct, Margaret Bell interjected, calmly. You were speaking, Mr. Kemp. The Reverend had just stepped away. Reverend Brooke flushed. I only moved a pace or two. A pace or two, Miss Marple murmured, without looking up from her knitting. Mallory's pen paused. Thank you, Miss Bell. Mr. Farrow? Edward shrugged, near the sideboard. Pouring a drink? During the game? Mallory asked. Edward hesitated. I don't recall exactly. Miss Marple glanced up then, her expression kindly. It's so difficult to remember small things when one is upset, isn't it? Edward shot her a sharp look, but said nothing. Miss Whitby? Mallory prompted. Clara swallowed. I was standing near Edward. We were talking. About? Mallory asked. Nothing important. Nothing is ever. Quite nothing, Miss Marple observed mildly. Clara's eyes flickered to her, then away. Mallory closed his notebook. Very well. Now I'd like to talk about the game itself. There was a subtle shift in the room. You each drew a card, he continued. Roles were assigned. Yes, said Mr. Kemp, purely for amusement. And yet, Mallory said, one of those cards was later found hidden in the pantry. He let the words settle. Liar, Margaret Bell said quietly. Mallory nodded. Indeed. Now tell me, why would anyone remove a card from the table at all? No one answered. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Perhaps, she said, because it was no longer needed. Mr. Kemp smiled thinly. I'm afraid I don't follow. Oh, I think you do, Miss Marple replied pleasantly. You see, the game allowed people to accuse one another openly, to lie, to deflect, to observe, all without consequence. For someone who enjoys control, it must have been quite delightful. Mallory turned to her. You believe the game was chosen deliberately? Yes. Mrs. Farrow enjoyed games that placed her at the center, but someone else enjoyed them for a different reason, Edward scoffed. This is absurd. Are you suggesting we planned this like some sort of theatrical performance? Miss Marple looked at him kindly. Not we, dear. One person. Mr. Kemp's fingers tightened on the arm of his chair. Mrs. Farrow, Miss Marple went on, was about to say something important, something that required everyone's attention, something that would have altered several lives. Mallory leaned forward. You believe she intended to announce the codicil? I believe, Miss Marple said gently, that she enjoyed announcements. Clara gasped softly. And I believe, Miss Marple continued, that someone knew it was coming and could not allow it to happen. Mr. Kemp laughed quietly. This is all very interesting, Miss Marple, but you have no proof. No, she agreed. Not yet. She set her knitting aside and looked directly at him. But I do have a question. When the lights went out, you said you were by the mantelpiece. Yes, and yet Miss Marple said you were the only person who knew precisely where the fuse box was, and how to reach it without hesitation. Mallory straightened. That's true. You handled the house's legal affairs. Mr. Kemp's smile faltered. I fail to see. You fail to see, Miss Marple interrupted gently, because you are still playing the game. The room was utterly silent now. The blow was struck before the lights went out, she said. A quick, precise movement. Mrs. Farrow never had time to cry out. The darkness merely provided confusion, an alibi of chaos. Mallory's gaze fixed on Mr. Kemp. And the card? Miss Marple smiled faintly, left behind to suggest panic. But panic leaves fingerprints everywhere. This did not. Mr. Kemp rose abruptly. This is outrageous. Is it? Miss Marple asked softly. You met with Mrs. Farrow days before her death. You argued she intended to change her will again, didn't she? To remove you entirely. Mr. Kemp's face drained of color. She had begun to see through you, Miss Marple said, and people who thrive on influence find irrelevance quite unbearable. For a moment it seemed he might speak. Instead, he sank back into his chair. Inspector Mallory stood. Mr. Kemp, I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of murder. Clara let out a sob. Edward stared in disbelief. Margaret Bell closed her eyes briefly, as though confirming something long suspected. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more. Such a dangerous thing, she murmured, to mistake cleverness for invisibility. Outside, the village bells began to ring for evening service, their sound drifting through the windows. Calm, familiar, and utterly unchanged. Little hot. Horn, Miss Marple reflected, would return to normal soon enough. But it would remember. The arrest of Mr. Kemp sent a ripple through the village that Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction. Not because she took pleasure in another's downfall, but because the truth once unearthed, was always the most instructive teacher of human nature. She stayed at Holly Lodge that evening, invited to remain until the house was formally secured, and watched the household settle into a strained calm. Edward Farrow wandered the drawing room with restless energy, muttering under his breath, while Clara Whitby sat near the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, pale and tense. Margaret Bell moved among them with a purposeful quiet, ensuring nothing was displaced or disturbed. Miss Marple, knitting in her usual corner, observed each small movement with the patience of someone accustomed to watching human behavior unfold like a slow, intricate pattern. Inspector Mallory, having secured Mr. Kemp at the local constabulary, returned briefly to make arrangements for the property and to ensure everyone's statements were fully recorded. His eyes met Miss Marple's with a mixture of respect and gratitude, acknowledging, silently, the part she had played in unraveling the mystery. As the room settled into uneasy silence, Miss Marple spoke softly, almost to herself. "People often forget the simplest things," she said. "It is the things taken for granted that tell the truest story." She glanced toward the corner where the card lay, still slightly askew from the previous night. A card, a glance, a hesitation, so easily overlooked, and yet so revealing. Clara shifted, glancing up. "Do you think anyone else suspected him?" she asked. "I think," Miss Marple replied gently, "that suspicion often has no time to form. People prefer tidy explanations, an accident, bad luck, a momentary lapse. It is more comfortable than admitting that someone they knew could act with such deliberate intent." Edward, standing near the window, finally spoke, his voice low and grudging. "I can't believe it. Harold, he always seemed so proper." Miss Marple did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked at him thoughtfully. "Proper people are capable of very improper actions," she said finally. "It is not always the obvious traits that define a person's character, but the small, carefully concealed ones." The fire crackled, filling the room with warmth, and Miss Marple allowed herself a moment's reflection. She thought of the game, its rules, and the careful orchestration of deception that had so conveniently masked intent. How easy it was for the guilty to rely on disorder, and how little it took to unmask them if one paid attention. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts, and Mrs. Grant entered, carrying a small tray with tea and biscuits. Her eyes were red from crying, but she managed a faint smile at Miss Marple. "I thought perhaps you might like a cup," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Grant," Miss Marple replied warmly. "Very kind of you." As the housekeeper set the tray down, Miss Marple continued almost conversationally. "Do you remember how the lights went out, Mrs. Grant?" "Yes, ma'am," she said softly. "I just stepped outside for logs. I heard the shout and came back as quickly as I could." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And did you notice anyone moving unusually before you returned?" Mrs. Grant shook her head. "No, ma'am. Everyone seemed startled, that was all." Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly. That is precisely what the murderer counted on, the assumption that everyone is startled, everyone panicked. But people often reveal themselves in such moments, even without knowing it." The doorbell chimed suddenly, and Edward turned, startled. Miss Marple's eyes followed him, calmly. At the door stood a local journalist, eager to report on the arrest. Edward hesitated, as if uncertain whether to allow the intrusion. "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "Let the village have its gossip, but not yet. There is more to learn before words are scattered carelessly." Edward frowned, but stepped aside to let the reporter in. Miss Marple, returning her attention to the fire, allowed her thoughts to drift back to the tiny details of the previous night. The positions of the guests, the tilt of the card, the subtle tensions between those who appeared innocent and those who had secrets to guard. Every thread had been accounted for now, every hesitation noticed, and yet she knew that the final understanding, the full measure of the human intentions at play, would only emerge when the guilty party confronted the consequences of their own deception. And in that quiet, she felt the unmistakable thrill of anticipation. The game, as she had always known, was far from over. The following morning brought a brittle clarity to Little Hawthorne. The snow had frozen into a thin, sparkling crust along the lanes, and the sun reflected off it in harsh, dazzling light. Miss Marple walked slowly toward Holly Lodge, taking her time to observe the village as it moved through its morning routines. Shopkeepers swept the steps of their stores. The baker's boy delivered fresh rolls. And yet beneath the familiar rhythm there was a tension, an undercurrent that had not been present before Mrs. Farrow's death. Inside Holly Lodge, the household was more subdued than it had been the previous evening. Clara Whitby sat near the fire, quietly stitching, her gaze frequently flicking toward the window as if expecting trouble to arrive from the snow-dusted lanes. Edward Farrow, restless and muttering, paced from one end of the drawing-room to the other. Margaret Bell moved with careful deliberate eye on, ensuring the room's orderliness, while Mrs. Grant tended to the tea tray with hands that no longer trembled but carried a subdued vigilance. Miss Marple, knitting once more in her favoured chair, allowed her attention to drift over each of them, noting the subtle signs of unease and lingering guilt. Inspector Mallory had returned early, bringing news from the constabulary that suggested the investigation was beginning to yield more than conjecture. Mr. Kemp had been cooperative during questioning, though his composure remained intact, and forensic examination of the fuse box and surrounding area had uncovered nothing conclusive, nothing that might immediately incriminate anyone beyond suspicion. "Miss Marple," Mallory said, as he seated himself near her, "I think it's time to revisit one particular detail from the evening of the murder." "Which detail would that be, Inspector?" she asked, her knitting paused and her gaze attentive. "The movements just before the lights went out. Everyone's positions, exactly who could see whom, and what each person could have done in those crucial moments." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, that is always the most revealing portion of any game, or any crime for that matter." Mallory produced a diagram he had sketched of the drawing-room, marking where each guest had stood. "I want you to look at this," he said, "and tell me what you notice." Miss Marple examined the simple diagram carefully, tracing the positions of Mrs. Farrow, the guests, the card table, and the fuse box. She allowed her eyes to linger over small details, the relative distances, the angles of sight, the possible movements that would not have drawn attention. "It is very neat," she said quietly. "So very neat that one might be tempted to assume everyone moved naturally, innocently." "Exactly," Mallory replied. "Yet we know someone acted deliberately." Miss Marple lifted a finger to her lips in thought. Yes, and the timing of the lights, it was not merely convenient, it was protective. Whoever struck the blow ensured that the chaos would cover the act. But there is something else, something subtle, which is the positions themselves, she said, pointing at the diagram. "Observe who had clear sight of Mrs. Farrow at all times. There is only one person whose eyes could not have avoided hers even for a second, whose actions would have been witnessed had they been hurried or clumsy." Mallory leaned closer. "You mean?" Miss Marple tapped the diagram lightly. "The person closest to the card table when the announcement was about to be made, the person who needed the lights to fall at just the right moment to create cover. Look at the angle, the timing. It all points to a deliberate orchestration, not mere panic." Clara, sitting nearby, looked up sharply, her lips parting in a small, worried gasp. Edward's pacing slowed, his face tightening. Margaret Bell remained impassive, though her eyes flicked knowingly toward the diagram. Mrs. Grant's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the teacups. "The perpetrator," Miss Marple said, "was not motivated solely by money. Greed would have sufficed without such precision. No, this required anticipation, calculation, and the assumption that no one would notice the tiniest shift of a card or the briefest hesitation of a glance." Mallory exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing. "So we wait for a reaction." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "We engage the suspect carefully. Watch and see what cracks. The guilty cannot help revealing themselves if approached correctly. The trap is already set. The question now is whether they will step into it." She returned to her knitting, her movements calm and unhurried, as if nothing at all was happening. But within that stillness lay the most precise observation of all, a quiet, methodical patience that had solved countless puzzles before, and would, Miss Marple knew, reveal the final truth here as well. The game was not yet finished. The final move, subtle and deliberate, was only a matter of time. That afternoon, the guests of Holly Lodge were invited once more, ostensibly to clarify minor inconsistencies, though Miss Marple recognized the true purpose immediately. The drawing room, stripped now of any superfluous ornamentation, seemed almost smaller, pressing the gathered group closer together. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a quiet anticipation that only heightened as each person found a seat. Miss Marple positioned herself in her usual corner, knitting still in hand, her calm demeanor a contrast to the subtle agitation around her. Edward Farrow sat near the window, restless and pale, while Clara Whitby remained close to the fire, her hands folded tightly. Margaret Bell observed silently, her posture poised and deliberate. Even Reverend Brooke, who generally avoided confrontation, seemed uneasy, his eyes flicking nervously between the others. Inspector Mallory addressed the group formally, explaining that the purpose of this gathering was to review the events of the fatal evening. He invited each person to recount, as precisely as possible, their movements and actions just before the lights went out. Miss Marple listened carefully, noting every hesitation, every fumbled word, and the subtle cues that betrayed a mind struggling to maintain composure. When it came to Mr. Kemp, his account was meticulous, almost rehearsed. He described standing by the mantelpiece, speaking with Reverend Brooke, asserting that he had not moved until the lights went out. Miss M. Marple's gaze lingered on him, her knitting paused. There was a peculiar rigidity to his posture, an unnatural stillness that spoke more loudly than words. She observed the small, almost imperceptible tightening of his fingers on the arm of his chair, the slight flicker of unease in his eyes. "One last question," Miss Marple said softly, her voice carrying a calm authority that drew the room's attention. "When the lights failed, what did you do, Mr. Kemp?" He straightened. I was momentarily confused, like everyone else. Then you acted," she interrupted gently. "Precisely. You acted with intention, while the rest hesitated. And that, I believe, is the crucial difference." A hush fell over the room. Edward shifted uncomfortably. Clara's breath caught, her eyes wide. Margaret Bell's expression remained neutral, but Miss Marple noted a small, almost imperceptible nod in her direction, as if confirming a long-held suspicion. Reverend Brooke, pale and anxious, simply stared at the floor. Miss Marple continued, her voice unwavering. The card table, the playing card left in the pantry, the timing of the lights. Each element was orchestrated to conceal a single act, a deliberate blow, struck in a calculated moment to prevent a revelation that Mrs. Farrow was on the verge of announcing. She looked directly at Mr. Kemp, her gaze steady and uncompromising. "You misjudged the situation. You believed you could control it, as you always do. But control is fragile, and truth has a way of revealing itself." Mr. Kemp's lips pressed together tightly. For a moment the room was suspended in tension, as though waiting for a confession to escape. Inspector Mallory stepped forward. "Mr. Kemp, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Mrs. Farrow." The color drained from Kemp's face. Edward let out a sharp exhalation. Clara's hands flew to her mouth, and even Reverend Brooke's shoulders slumped slightly in relief. Margaret Bell's eyes softened, though they retained a glint of acknowledgement toward Miss Marple. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her movements calm, deliberate. "It is always astonishing," she said softly, almost to herself, "how people imagine cleverness renders them invisible. The truth, however, is a patient observer, and it sees everything." Outside, the village continued with its routines, the bakery's bell tinkling, the soft crunch of footsteps in the lingering snow, the distant toll of the church bell. Within Holly Lodge, a tense quiet settled, punctuated only by the faint, steady clicking of Miss Marple's needles. The game was over, the deception revealed, and yet the lessons of the evening lingered, quietly inscribed in the minds of those who had been there. The following morning, Holly Lodge felt different, though nothing had changed in its walls or furniture. The air was quieter, heavier with a mixture of relief and residual tension. Miss Marple arrived early, finding the house already bustling with preparations for the departure of Inspector Mallory, who had returned briefly from the constabulary to finalize paperwork and statements. Edward Farrow sat near the window, staring into the snow-dusted garden, while Clara Whitby moved restlessly about the room, collecting small belongings as if preparing for a journey she had not yet fully committed to. Margaret Bell, serene and precise as ever, had taken upon herself the task of ensuring that the house looked orderly for what she described as the inevitable return to normalcy. Mrs. Grant, pale but composed, moved quietly, placing cups and saucers upon the tray for the final tea of the investigation. Miss Marple, knitting in her familiar corner, observed the scene with the same patience she brought to every puzzle, accepting the human reactions of shock, relief, and residual guilt as evidence in their own subtle way. Inspector Mallory, after ensuring that Mr. Kemp was securely in custody, turned his attention to clarifying minor details and closing loose ends. He consulted with Edward and Clara, his questions formal, but with a measure of courtesy that indicated an appreciation for the cooperation and patience of those left behind. Miss Marple, as usual, made no overt display of involvement, though her presence was quietly influential, her quiet observations guiding the discussions without drawing notice. Once the official business concluded, the room gradually returned to a subdued calm. Miss Marple folded her knitting and addressed the small assembly with her usual gentle authority. "It is remarkable," she said softly, "how much can be revealed when people believe they are simply recounting what they have already said. Truth, in the end, is patient. It will outlast hesitation, oversight, and even careful deceit." Edward Farrow, now visibly calmer but still unsettled, asked, "Do you think the village will ever forget this?" His tone was part accusation, part uncertainty. Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "No, my dear. Little Hawthorne will remember, but it will also understand that the most ordinary among us can be capable of the most extraordinary interventions. And those who were clever enough to conceal their intentions have now seen that such cleverness is never invisible to a careful observer." Clara Whitby, pale but composed, spoke softly. "And Mr. Kemp, he will face justice then?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "as he should. Justice, when measured properly, requires nothing more than patience, careful observation, and an understanding of human nature." Margaret Bell inclined her head. "And now we may finally resume our lives, though tempered with the knowledge of how fragile appearances can be." Miss Marple smiled faintly, returning her attention to the quiet pattern of her knitting. "Indeed. People are like threads," she said gently, "intertwined in ways that are invisible until tension is applied. And then the pattern is revealed, all at once, clear and unmistakable." The snow outside had begun to melt in the weak winter sun, glistening against the lanes and rooftops. Holly Lodge, though scarred by the events of the past few days, stood quietly in the village as if nothing had happened, and yet, in its stillness, it bore the memory of secrets, revelations, and the patient triumph of truth. As Miss Marple gathered her things to leave, she cast a final glance around the room. The villagers' faces were thoughtful, subdued, yet there was a renewed steadiness in their expressions. Little Hawthorne would continue, as it always had, with an added awareness of the delicate balance between appearances and reality, and with the quiet certainty that some truths, however well hidden, would always emerge under a careful, watchful eye. Miss Marple walked slowly back through the village, the crisp winter air brushing her cheeks, and for a moment she allowed herself to notice the ordinary comforts of Little Hawthorne, smoke curling from chimneys, the distant laughter of children playing in the snow, and the faint smell of baking bread drifting from Mrs. Hammond's shop. The village had returned, in outward appearance at least, to its familiar rhythms, yet beneath the surface, the events of the past days had left a permanent impression. Everyone she passed carried a subtle awareness, a renewed understanding that the ordinary could conceal the extraordinary. Arriving home, she poured herself a cup of tea and settled by the fire, her knitting resting quietly in her lap. She allowed her mind to revisit the intricate web of motives, fears, and small deceptions that had brought Mr. Kemp to his inevitable downfall. Every glance, every hesitated word, every small action, had contributed to the revelation. She smiled faintly at the elegance of human behavior, the way character, when observed with care, could never truly be hidden. The thought of Mrs. Farrow lingered, a reminder that those who exert power over others often sow the seeds of their own misfortune. She had been formidable, clever, and charming in her way, yet she had underestimated human impatience and ambition. And so, a carefully timed blow, a feigned accident, and the misdirection of a simple game had been all it took to disturb the village's peace. Yet in observing, in patiently waiting for the pattern to emerge, Miss Marple had confirmed once more that nothing truly escapes notice if one watches closely enough. She reflected on the resilience of Little Hawthorne, a village that thrived on routine but that could, when provoked, reveal the deeper currents beneath the polite surface. It was a reminder, as she sipped her tea, of the delicate balance between appearances and reality, the balance she had always navigated with such quiet skill. The postman's knock at the door broke the silence, delivering letters and parcels, reminders that life in the village went on, indifferent to the tragedy it had witnessed. Miss Marple set aside her cup and opened her mail, her thoughts already returning to the small observations that might otherwise go unnoticed, a crease in a letter, a hastily scribbled note, a hint of tension in a signature. Human nature, she mused, revealed itself in such minute details. As dusk fell and the first star, Bares began to sparkle in the cold winter sky, Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting now complete. There was a satisfaction in resolution, in seeing truth emerge unbidden. Yet she knew the world would continue to hold mysteries, small, intimate, hidden in the corners of everyday life. And she, quietly observant and endlessly patient, would always be there to see them through. Outside, Little Hawthorne settled into the soft embrace of night, its snow-sprinkled lanes and chimneys bathed in moonlight. Within the village, the ordinary and extraordinary coexisted, forever entwined, and Miss Marple, in her gentle, unassuming way, had once again reminded them that secrets, however carefully concealed, have a way of coming to light. With that thought, she drew the shawl around her shoulders, picked up her knitting, and allowed herself the calm satisfaction of a mystery well solved, knowing that human nature would continue to provide stories and lessons long after the last card was turned. The following morning brought a delicate hush over Little Hawthorne. Frost clung to the hedgerows, and the soft light of dawn filtered through bare branches, illuminating the village in a pale, serene glow. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with a fresh pot of tea, allowed herself a moment to watch the quiet streets, taking note of the familiar patterns. The postman delivering letters with measured steps, the grocer setting out crates of oranges, the faint movement of a cat slinking across a frost-covered wall. The village had resumed its ordinary rhythms, yet the events of the past days lingered subtly in the air, like an echo that refused to dissipate entirely. Her thoughts returned to Holly Lodge, to the precise orchestration that had culminated in Mrs. Farrow's death, and to the intricate human dynamics she had observed. Each guest, each action, had been a thread in a larger tapestry, some obvious, ours, others almost imperceptible. And now, with Mr. Kemp in custody, the patterns had emerged in full, the design made clear by patience and careful observation. A gentle knock at the door roused her. It was Mrs. Grant, carrying a small parcel. "For you, Miss Marple," she said softly, handing it over. Her eyes were bright but tinged with the lingering fatigue of recent events. Miss Marple accepted it with a faint smile. "Thank you, my dear. You've been very kind." Once alone again, she unwrapped the parcel to find a neatly bound notebook, its leather cover soft with age. Inside were Mrs. Farrow's notes, jottings, lists, reminders of meetings and appointments, and small personal reflections. Miss Marple leafed through them carefully, noting how much could be learned from such ordinary documentation. There were observations of villagers' habits, remarks about minor disputes, and entries about her intentions to alter her will. Each detail, seemingly mundane, was a glimpse into her mind, revealing both her strengths and her vulnerabilities. Sitting back, Miss Marple reflected on the subtle interplay between power and human nature. Mrs. Farrow had wielded influence deftly, yet underestimated the quiet ambition of those around her. Mr. Kemp, calculating and meticulous, had believed himself untouchable, confident that his careful planning would render him invisible. But, as always, even the most intricate scheme left traces for those attentive enough to notice. She sipped her tea, the warmth steadying her thoughts. In the village, life continued, the hum of domestic routines, the soft laughter of children, the distant chime of church bells. Yet beneath the surface, a newfound awareness had taken root. The villagers, even unconsciously, would carry forward a recognition that appearances could be deceiving, that human intentions were often layered and complex, and that the ordinary might conceal something extraordinary. As the day progressed, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served not by hasty judgment or dramatic confrontation, but by observation, patience, and understanding of human nature. Holly Lodge would heal in its own time. The villagers would resume their lives with a subtle, enduring caution, and she, as always, would continue to watch and note the rhythms of people and places ready for the next puzzle that life would place before her. The winter sun lowered toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the village. Miss Marple closed the notebook gently, placed it on the table beside her, and returned to her knitting. Outside, little Hawthorn glimmered in the quiet evening light, serene yet wiser, and she, content with the resolution of one mystery, allowed herself the calm anticipation of others to come, knowing that human nature, in all its complexity, would never cease to provide both questions and answers for those willing to observe. As Christmas passed, and the first snow of the new year began to soften into gentle slush, little Hawthorn settled into a semblance of normalcy. Holly Lodge, though still marked by the memory of recent events, regained its orderly appearance. Curtains were drawn, rooms cleaned, and the subtle tension that had gripped its inhabitants gradually eased into a quieter awareness. The village, ever resilient, resumed its routines, yet those who had been present during the fateful Christmas Eve could not entirely forget the delicate balance of appearances and hidden truths. Miss Marple, seated by her fire with her knitting, reflected on the outcome with her customary calm. The case had been resolved not by force, not by confrontation, but by observation, by noticing the subtle shifts in posture, the hesitations in speech, and the fleeting expressions that revealed the tea. Ruth behind carefully maintained facades. Mr. Kemp had been removed from the village, his calculated schemes laid bare, and justice, patient and exacting, had been allowed to take its course. Clara Whitby, though still recovering from the strain, had begun to emerge from her self-imposed isolation, reassured that suspicion had not fallen unjustly upon her. Edward Farrow, chastened and subdued, moved through the village with a quieter demeanor, forced by circumstance and by insight to reckon with the limitations of pride and entitlement. Even Margaret Bell and Reverend Brooke carried themselves with a new understanding of human nature's complexities, a subtle wariness tempered by relief that the tragedy had ended without further loss. Miss Marple considered the village itself, the familiar lanes and cottages she had walked so often. Human beings, she thought, were like threads in a tapestry, some bright and bold, some hidden and delicate, all intertwined in ways that could not always be discerned at first glance. And yet, with patience and attention, the pattern always emerged, revealing motives, secrets, and the consequences of choices made in quiet corners or under the glow of a Christmas fire. As she set aside her knitting for the evening, the glow of the fire reflecting off the window panes, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Life, as it always did, would continue in Little Hawthorn. Villagers would gather for Sunday services, children would play along the snowy lanes, and the ordinary rhythms of domestic life would resume. But beneath that everyday tranquility lay the awareness that even the most familiar faces could conceal hidden ambitions, petty jealousies, or moments of quiet heroism. And Miss Marple, ever watchful, ever quietly engaged with the subtleties of human behavior, would remain at her window, her sharp eyes and patient mind ready to know what others overlooked. For in the ordinary, she knew, lay the extraordinary, and in the ordinary village of Little Hawthorne, the mysteries of human nature would continue to unfold, as inexorable and fascinating as ever. With that she rose, drew the curtains against the chill of the winter night, and settled once more by the fire, content in the knowledge that one more thread in the vast tapestry of human life had been carefully and completely untangled. The Christmas Eve game of deceit was over, its lessons etched into memory, and the village, resilient, cautious, and quietly wiser, rested under the gentle watch of a detective who understood the human heart better than anyone else ever could.